Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota. I am your co-host and co-author. Here with me is my co-host, co-author, and Time Magazine's World Builder of the Year,
Trent Hergenrader.
And the fans go
and
wild.
The fans, yes, remain seated. Yeah.
Well, that's the life of an academic. We want them to stay seated.
Yeah, I'm the most famous academic on my block.
That's all we can hope for, right?
That's right.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Chapter 13 of the World Building Workshop, which is simulations. It's all about simulations. And we wanted to specify before we even get going that if there is the potential for us to not explain something in great enough detail, it might be chapters 13 and 14, because this is, as Trent put it, our bread and butter. And we know a lot about simulations and games and playfulness. So we're going to try our best to keep this at a very general layperson level. And if you do have any questions about some of these things, I'd refer you back to our episode about that lost chapter, chapter 5.5, which is all about gamefulness, playfulness, and fun, because we did deconstruct a lot of these ideas in that episode. So if you're not a gamer, if you're not somebody who's thought a lot about what the difference between a simulation and a game is, we're going to try to give you that backstory. Right. But if for some reason you have some questions, I'd refer you either to the book itself or to the episode we did on chapter 5.5, gamefulness, playfulness, and fun.
I would say too that we are very familiar with lots of different games over a longer period of time that fit into these categories. And again, going back to our love of Wikipedia, the useful tool that we think that it is, if we bring up a game, like some of the most commonly heard of games in the simulation area would be like The Sims and Civilization and
SimCity. We've talked about SimCity,
right? We talk about SimCity.
Yeah.
If we make that reference, if you just go check it out on Wikipedia, you will figure it out. If we don't provide the appropriate context for them. The other thing too to think about, this is where a lot of these games, if you've got Civilization or SimCity or whatever, and you've never been a gamer before, you can go on some discount sites like Green Man Gaming or GOG.com or even on Steam and pick some of these up for like $5. Right? You don't need it because they're old, right? A lot of these games, you buy older versions of the game, you can at least play SimCity for like 15 minutes and get a sense of what it's like to, this is how a simulation like this would work, right? So it's nice that a lot of these games have been around for so long and people are still big fans of, playing back these games that are from the early 2000s or whatever. So that's another opportunity for you to be able to say this is a low risk, low cost way for you to be able to try out some of these games. And like during summer sales or fall sales or whatever, they could be like 99 cents, right? So it's like, go buy up a bunch of them. Like I did that when I was looking at turn-based role-playing games. I just waited for them to go on sale and bought like 12 of them for $6 or something like that, and it's like, oh, well, now I could play all these games that were big in the 2006 or whatever. So anyway, so let's just get started. Because it's funny too, because you said, there's the difference between simulations and games. And it's like, well, some simulations are games, some simulations aren't games, and then there's games that have simulation aspects and role play aspects. So I'm going to leave it to you, Steve. Give us a definition.
Thank you.
What is a simulation? And I guess that's the question that to go back even towards other things that we've said. One of the things that I think is always so nutty when we're talking about games and learning and people are like, oh, it's a flash in the pan, and it's a fad or whatever. It's like, we've been doing simulations and role plays forever, right? Like for a long time in all of these different kinds of domains, just no one calls them games, right? You know what I mean? It's like, and again, historically going back, this idea that game and leisure and play were opposites of work and rigor, and all these other kind of things. And it's like, okay, well, once you sort of lay all of that bare, those distinctions are really quite dumb. So this is where, coming back to simulations, how would you define like what a simulation is? And then like we can just kind of riff on this going back and forth, simulations in games and then simulations in the context of a world building project.
Yeah, it is also, for those of you listening, just to provide a little bit of contour to this, part of the reason these definitions actually do matter is because what we're suggesting in this chapter about simulations versus the next chapter, which is about role play, they're two different things. Like they are intentionally very different. They are attitudinally very different. Your students would experience them differently. So we actually intentionally split these things apart because we didn't want to confuse the processes we would apply for one with the other. And I'm going to draw on the 2017 book, Exploding the Castle, that I co-authored with my colleague, friend, advisor, Mike Young. The book itself was co-edited. So he and I did write the beginning and the end. It's sort of bookended by us. And the middle part was all written by a variety of scholars about games and learning. And before we wanted to introduce the audience of that book to all these different ideas, all of these different projects, all of these different theories about playfulness in the classroom. We wanted to specify for them, we wrote this before we even asked them to write for the book, what we thought a game was versus what we thought a simulation was. So I did talk a little bit about this in that earlier chapter 5.5 episode, but I'm going to spell it out as clearly as I can here for you as our audience of this podcast. A game is a tool with designed goals that requires interaction with an environment, virtual or real, and can include simulated elements of reality like gravity or momentum, but is not limited by parameters of the real world. Games are governed by rule sets. They take full advantage of imagination and creativity. They often include scoring criteria or measurable win-loss outcomes, and ultimately, they are explicitly directed toward playfulness. That is a thing that we use to differentiate a game from a simulation, at least in this particular context. Games are meant to be playful generally. That's not always true. Again, refer you back to that earlier episode. But a simulation, by contrast, is a goal-driven tool that requires interaction with an environment, again, virtual or real, and it can share some mechanics with games like points or missions and timers, but it's explicitly designed to veridically emulate some element of reality, an interaction, a process, a situation, a phenomenon. And again, to sort of contrast this with what a game is, play is attenuated in order to represent the target interaction process, situation, or phenomenon as accurately as possible. So you can have some gray area between these things. I would say, for instance, Kerbal Space Program is sort of a hybrid of these. It is a simulation that is also playful. It's meant to be effective at teaching people about rocketry and about physics, but also you play as a bunch of little green aliens who are building these rockets, and it's fun to make them explode. There are a variety of other things I put in this category. I used to, with my students in my interactive storytelling and systems design classes, use the game Democracy 3. That's the word democracy with the number 3 after it. It is the third in a series of democracy simulations, and the purpose of them is to tinker with all the complex systems that make up a country and see what that does to drive approval rating up or down, to change the health of your overall population. It's quite similar to SimCity if you stripped out all the gamey parts and left behind a simulation. And I think that, for us, for Mike and I, was an important element of having a discussion about what games in education could or should look like, because we didn't want people to think that everything that we were describing or everything we were talking about was an exact parallel to what a simulation of that thing would be. So a good example here, I guess, would be Super Mario Brothers as a game has elements of reality that are simulated. Mario can jump, you can hit blocks, you can pick things up, but that's not quite the same as doing those activities. And because we care a lot about that one-to-one ratio between learning objective and play objective or activity objective, we didn't want to confuse those things and make it seem like a simulation could be radically outside of reality and still be used to teach that specific process or phenomenon as accurate. And I'm sure we'll get multiple other examples as we're going along here, but the main reason why we want you to think about this as somebody who's implementing these strategies in your learning environment, whether it's a classroom or a workshop or anywhere else, is because we want you to be able to plan accordingly for the audience you're working with and attend to the kinds of needs they would specifically have. So if you're going through with the application of ADDIE and TPACK and thinking about what should I be doing for my adult learners? What should I be doing for these fifth graders? What should I be doing for this summer camp? Those are all going to look very different. And you need to make sure that if you're trying to teach a specific process, you're thinking about what is it that you can do that's as realistic and accurate as possible versus I'm trying to teach about social interaction or cooperation. So we're going to play a game of, I don't know, war, right? Like a kid might pick up a stick and pretend it's a gun or whatever. Like that simulation of a specific kind of adult activity is still oriented toward playfulness, not toward actually simulating a war. Does that make sense from your perspective, Trent?
Yeah, I'm probably not the audience, but yeah.
Right. Let me rephrase.
Yeah.
Do you think I missed anything? What would you point out as sort of your differentiation or your partition between those things?
No, I mean, I think you probably thought about that harder than I have. And I think that's why your articulation of it, I think, is fine. And that's also where there is, I think, mileage to be gained about debating where something leaves off as a game, where something starts as a simulation, where something is a role play, right? What are the elements of the others? And it's like, it's not all that important
Right.
for anything other than that discussion of like,
Hmm.
so if we would define SimCity, or if we would define, Kerbal Space Program in a certain
Hmm.
way, well, then how well does that definition hold up to other kinds of examples, which is more like the theoretical or, definitional kind of debates that happen in academia that anybody who's not involved with it doesn't care, right? And
Do you remember the conversation? There was a long debate at Games Learning and Society, not about this topic, although
yeah,
this did come up sometimes, but about ludic games or
yeah, yeah,
what constituted narrative, right? There are all these sort of esoteric, very niche discussions about this stuff. And we said this in our episode about chapter 5.5. Like, nobody cares. Like, this isn't actually
yeah,
the
yeah.
important thing. What's important is the tool you've chosen, whether it's a game or a simulation or a role play or whatever,
Right, right.
is it actually servicing the learning objective that you have? And
Right,
that's the
right.
most important point of
Yeah.
all of this.
Yeah, yeah. So that's where, I mean, for example, this I've mentioned this a couple times that I'm working on this chapter, or an article rather. Collaborative world building is the story world special issue, and I'm writing a chapter on collaborative world building and tabletop role playing games. And it's a case here in which, if I just said role playing games, right? We were just referring to this. I think I mentioned this in the book. The role playing game studies, transmedia approaches. The editors are Jose Zagal and Sebastian Detterding from 2018, and they spent an entire chapter just talking about different things that fall into the arena of being defined by role-playing games. So this is a case in which I want to say in this, what I am talking about specifically is a tabletop role-playing game that, is played in this way because, there's lots of digital role-playing games that follow some of the same rules, but not others. So anyway, point being is that the definitions only matter when you are in this field of talking about sort of game studies, and things like that. And for the most part, you don't need to worry about it unless you are a gamer or you're interested in it. Because it's a way of distinguishing between, sort of fine definitions between things. And oftentimes, if you're just using this as a tool in your class, you're not going to need those fine tuning, fine tuna. Anyway.
I think we talk a little bit about this in the book, but one of the reasons why too we care a lot about simulations specifically as compared to role play, and one of the reasons why we want to differentiate those things is also because simulations are useful for a variety of what if scenarios.
I was just going to say, yeah.
So yeah, if you're looking to ask your learners to compare outcomes or project possible outcomes based on some set of criteria, simulations are really, really good for that. It's not to say you can't do that with role play, but role play is, again, sort of designed for that playfulness, for the creativity, for the opportunity to take liberties with the environmental context. Whereas with the simulation, you're really trying to stick to what is the available evidence, how might these things interact or intersect, and what would the outcome be if they did run into each other. I think we were talking about the various geological strata and how the intersection between various social forces acts as sort of tectonic plates hitting each other. That's what simulations are really good for. They're good for evaluating where those tectonic plates hit each other and what the consequences of that would be.
Yeah. And I think looking at this too, so there's a couple things that I wanted to say. One is I want to talk a little bit, maybe after this, I make this other point about the concept of procedural rhetoric. Is something that the book Persuasive Games by Ian Bogos goes into this extensively, like what the whole book is about. But basically, the mechanics and the rules and the probabilities and things like that are not God-given, right? I mean, those are things that programmers and game designers are deciding. If you choose this, what are the odds that it will or won't succeed? Or like, if you demolish this building, will your approval ratings go up and down? There is a human being who has decided that result in the game. It's not like it's true. It's not like it's necessarily, magic and automatically plugged into reality. Although these games, especially if you're downloading Cities or SimCity, some of the, SimCity, whatever the most recent one is, or Civilization, the computing power behind these things is ridiculous. And it's really hard to know exactly why. I destroyed this building and my approval rating went down. And I don't know why, you know what I mean? And it's like, you'd have to play through multiple things or whatever. But that's basically the idea of another layer of a simulation is getting into those mechanics. Like, why do you think this result or this decision would have wound up having this result? Like, what is that based on? Why are you know what I mean? It's like, oh, you can just raise taxes and no one ever gets mad. Like, that's not a realistic simulation. But on the other hand, it's like there are other things that you can do in the games to be successful. And it's like, well, would that really work in real life, right? It may be a wishful thinking kind of thing. I tend to think of role play scenarios as being generally first person perspectives, right? You are in a situated perspective and you are the one who are taking control of this person. And when you are doing that, you are often doing it in the first person. I did this, I want that. Even if you're just pretending to be somebody else in that moment, you can also role play with a third person perspective where he, she, they would have done this, you know what I mean, where it's less personalized, which can be useful, especially if you're dealing with somebody you wouldn't want necessarily a student to embody, you know, a criminal or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, you don't want to necessarily have to be like, you are this person in this moment. And then there's the sort of like the distant I would hesitate to say sort of the omniscient third, because this is where people will often talk about, like in a simulation, the godlike perspective that you have, like when you're in SimCity or whatever it is, right? And that's something in fiction. There are reasons why you would use a distant third, but typically you want to be using a close third or a first person, right? And it's like close third person and first person tend to be more associated in my mind as role-playing games, whereas the distant third is the godlike kind of perspective. But the reason why I don't also like that term, which is often thrown around as the godlike perspective, and maybe it's my background in philosophy, is that a god is all knowing, a god is all, you know, powerful, and it is everywhere at once. And no player can be all of those things, right? So it's like I had just said, you don't know what is going on, you know, behind the scenes in a computer game as to what the rationale is for why something happened, right? Like you say something and someone reacts in a certain way in a like role-playing game, or, you know, a simulation, you change this value and then something you totally didn't expect happens over here. If you were truly godlike, you would know, and you would have known ahead of time, you know what I mean? It's all foreordained or whatever. So it's like you're in a position where you are extremely far removed and you don't have like maybe a personal stake in it. You know what I mean? And like you will live for, especially in a game like SimCity, it goes on for hundreds of years, right? So beyond a single pastime. So it's not like you're role playing as the mayor making these decisions. It's more like you are somewhere out of space, out of time, watching these events sort of unfolding. And I think that's fairly useful. At least I've always found it to be useful to talk about it in those terms, because then it's like, well, why would you, if you want to have that really sort of visceral embodied experience, simulations are probably not quite what you're looking for, or maybe it's a simulation followed by a role play or something along those lines. So yeah, and I mean, and this is where too, just thinking about how many different kinds of scenario constructions, or like I was working with somebody in policy on this. It's sort of like, well, what would happen if we have a major natural disaster? We've just had, you know, a massive flood or a tornado or whatever, and students are trained on like, okay, well, this is what you would do in this scenario, right? And it's like, again, sort of like a simulation that this is where, you know, a tornado hasn't smashed this town, but let's say that it does, right? And then what would you do? Like, what would be the things that you would need to be looking at in terms of mobilizing the correct teams to come in, you know, all those kind of things. And then what would be the policies? And it's not like, oh, well, you are a policymaker and you need to write this. It's just like, what would one or a society or a government writ large be looking to make happen in this scenario?
We've talked actually a bit about using world building or world modeling as a mechanism to help civil servants or corporate actors or whomever try to figure out how do systems operate. And I think that's what simulations excel at, whereas role play is more how do people operate. I think a lot about this. There was a tool that was created, I can't remember the man's name, but he had created this tool that was about examining the amount of heat loss from a building. So he was an engineer who had created this extremely fine-tuned system that you could use. It was all digital, right? Like you can turn the dial and it'll increase this value or decrease that one. But the entire purpose of it was to look at airflow and how heat traps or doesn't get trapped inside a building. That sort of simulation, that closeness to being able to manipulate the environment and then be able to check for its effects, is just sort of categorically different than asking a learner to go and pretend they're the person installing new windows, right? Like there's a very different, again, it comes back to what is the learning objective associated with this. And I think
what you're doing and why.
It's the reason why you wouldn't necessarily role play a bunch of EMTs that are going out to save people's lives. You might simulate in a disaster management scenario, what would it be like if, and then what would your role be? What would you do next? Whatever, because your goal in that case is to practice that specific sequence of events to get a particular outcome. It's not going to be, I'm going to put on my EMT hat and pretend I'm an EMT and, you know, ma'am, I'm here to help or whatever. Like there's no need for that extra layer of performance on top of the evaluation of the system. And the system, we actually have the whole subsection in the book that's all about social and environmental changes on a timeline. The entire purpose of that being what happened when, and does it matter that it happened in this order, and what if this thing had happened instead. We also talk about wicked problems and black swan events, and those are all things that are intended to help understand a system. It's not really meant to tell a story about that system. So that's kind of another, I'm going to call that my unofficial definition of this stuff as we're sort of just talking about it. I think simulations are great for evaluating and acting out what systems do, they're not as useful for getting that close personal perspective or understanding the human
Right.
element of a lot of these things. It's more mechanical or technical. The
Right.
same way I would compare actually the difference between technical writing versus creative writing. I think
Right. Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
kind of similar to one another, you know?
And I think in that same sense, you can, if you wanted to create like a longer project, you do the world building, you get the world in the state that it's in, and then do a
Hmm.
simulation in which the world changes in some way, and you've got the way that the systems would respond, and then you can
Hmm.
finish that up with a role play where now you are, a disaster
Right.
response person, right? Like,
Hmm.
but they're each, like you were saying, each one of those things is doing a different thing to get at a
Sure.
different
Yeah.
kind of learning, right? So they're all valuable, but this is also why you just can't throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. And it's funny too, because people who I've talked to, through the many years where they've brought in games and they're doing different
Hmm.
things. I was just talking to somebody who was like, oh, well, I was doing some role play, but there were leaderboards, and whatever. And it was like
Hmm.
basically this gamification and game-based learning stuff that just kind of like threw against the wall. And he's like, well, some of it stuck and some of it didn't, and I don't know why. You know what I mean? He's a very smart guy, right? He's a brilliant guy. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's because the stuff that stuck happened to be aligning well. Like, that
Right.
activity aligned well with what you were trying to get them to do. And the other stuff that bounced off just didn't, right? I mean, like it may be a good
Hmm.
enough activity, but it was either, not applied to the right kind of, that activity was great, but it didn't really reinforce whatever you were learning at that time or whatever. These are the kind of things that I think both you and I have been doing for a lot of years with different academic colleagues and in different contexts, is saying, well, okay,
Hmm.
before we start, like it's good that you want to try and do something that's a little out of the box, and whatever, but like, what is your goal here? How much time do you
Hmm.
have? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And now let's start working through, rather than just like throwing everything against the wall to see what sticks. It's like, well, we know for a fact that this works this way, this works this way, and you can be a little,
Hmm.
not a little bit, you can be more exacting in terms of your
Hmm.
design for the class, your design for the activities, and all those kind of things.
Now that you're mentioning that, it brings to mind a few different projects I've worked on, and there is a really good example of this in here, where one of them was a virtual reality simulation or a virtual reality, let's call it an activity. It was designed largely for deployment in a museum setting or in some controlled academic or scholarly environment, but we had talked at one point about releasing it on Steam for a general audience. It was all about the post-World War II Nuremberg tribunals, the war tribunals for World War II and the Holocaust. There's actually a separate thing that was used to adjudicate the Holocaust. We don't have to get into the details about that, but the exercise was sort of an international effort of scholars, academics, trying to build something that would help Gen Z, Gen Alpha, the future of student populations, be able to make sense of what constituted war crimes and how those war crimes were adjudicated on the international stage. And
Mm-hmm.
Nuremberg was the first time that there was such a thing. There was no international law, so to speak, until Nuremberg took place after World War II. So we wanted to help learners figure out, how did those trials unfold? What did it look like on the inside of those things? And part of the reason we were able to do this, and at the time I was at the University of Connecticut, was because the state had given ownership of all the materials from the lead prosecutor at Nuremberg to the university for storage in the archive. And so myself, working with Ken Thompson and Clarissa Seglio and a few other people at the university, we're trying to figure out, what do we do with this archived material? Like, there's all this cool stuff that is first person documentation of what it was like to be a part of the trials. What were the lead prosecutors thinking about when they made these recommendations, or how did they choose who to include or exclude from the various goings on of that trial? And we had a 3-day charade to discuss with some other scholars from an international community, what could or should this virtual reality experience look like? Should it be playful? Should it not? Where would we draw the line between those things? We really wanted to avoid the perception that this was a game, quote unquote,
Right,
because
right, right,
nobody wants to make a game about the Holocaust.
right.
That seems like a real bad idea. And ultimately, one of the scholars that came and participated in that charade recommended not trying to pursue an accurate depiction or representation of the trial as it happened, largely because it's a thing. It's a historical event that already unfolded. We know the outcome, and these were the things that contributed to it. So if the user or the player, if you want to use that terminology, was participating in this experience and they had some contribution to the actual trial, wouldn't that mean they could be a determinative part of the outcome of the trial?
Right,
And would that
right.
mean you could then change the outcome of the trials? And do we really want people to understand that as manipulating history? How far does that get away from what actually transpired? Do you really want to make it possible for some of these war criminals to get away with what they did? Like, that
Right.
seems bad. So we ended up dialing it back to simulate the experience of being a contributing researcher on the prosecution's team. And so
Hmm.
all of these archived materials that had been 3D generated in virtual reality were then put into a scenario where the user or the player was evaluating primary source documents
Yeah.
as they existed in the archive, and they were contributing to the tribunal, but they weren't arguing the case, right? This is
Yeah.
not Ace
Yeah.
Attorney where you're getting up there and you're performing the case for an audience of people or for a jury. It was all intentionally designed around the research part of this because we knew that we could better align the objectives of that as a simulation
Right.
to our actual, the thing that you could do in the context of virtual reality, which in and of itself was kind of cool because you could pick up and move around and act on these primary source documents, but without giving too much playful agency to the
Yeah. Yep.
user
Yep.
because of all the potential ethical and other consequences of
Right.
doing that. Yeah.
Just to jump in real quick, because I mean, this is where too, as you were talking, I was thinking that agency is like the key thing. If you take agency away from a student or a player in one of
Mhm.
these simulations, then you've taken away everything. What's the difference between me just reading a chapter that doesn't change every time I go to the book and I read pages,
Mhm.
18 through 36? It's the same for everybody. Well, if I'm playing a simulation and my options are so severely limited and the outcomes are so clearly
Mhm.
preordained, it's really not that different than just reading a book, right? You know what I mean? And that's one of those
Mhm.
things that's like, why would you? It may be one thing to to have that sort of experience or at least whatever. But this is where going back to the idea of procedural rhetoric, right? Your choices should matter. They should be able to come up. They should produce different kinds of outcomes, and then
Mhm.
different playthroughs, different strategies should yield different outcomes. And one of the things that you can then examine is sort of like a meta examination is what is the rhetoric of the decision making trees, right? Like who
Mm.
decided what are the directions that all of these are going into, as opposed to, and I mean, this is something too that I think you tend to see in, like, I think, having gone to lots of kids museums with my kids and whatever.
I was just about to say children's museums are really, really useful for evaluating some of these things, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, where it's, in the conversation, I think you mentioned this term before, but if something is on rails, right, like a tabletop
Mhm.
role playing game campaign and, lots of different types of games are completely off the rails, right? You can go in whatever
Mhm.
direction as long as everybody at the table is kind of cool with it, you can do whatever. And being on the rails means it's like being on a roller coaster. You can't get off, right? Like you can't steer it. So it's bumper cars versus a roller coaster, right? So something is on
Mhm.
rails. And again, it's one of those things. There are reasons to do both of those things, but if you would get into a situation where you are doing a simulation or you're trying to, have something going on with the simulation and you really make player agency irrelevant, then it's really not going to be that effective. I don't think. Like people need to sort of have that cause and effect understanding of if they make different choices, there will be different outcomes, and they need to be allowed to make those choices, even if they're not great choices, right? Or
Mhm.
like, it just reminds me of, like doing like a differential diagnosis or something like that, right? Where it's like
Sure.
you can work your way through that process, and somebody who is really competent or has mastered that knows exactly going down that decision tree. They are narrowing options until they come up with
Sure.
their diagnosis, right? You need to let people go down that path, the wrong path, right? To be like, you don't know what it is, right? You know what I mean? Like you did not do the differential diagnosis well enough, and now you're confused as to what this lump on this person could be, right? So maybe that's not a great analogy, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about in terms of simulations. Is the learner has to be put into a spot where they know enough to understand what they're thinking, like, and this is where too, like, so much of this, we
Yeah.
were talking about SimCity, so much of it is less about the game, and this is why you need a teacher in the room. This is like, again, I feel like I'm exhausted by even saying this, but it's like the real benefit is saying, like, what were you thinking when you made that choice?
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
can you
Mhm.
articulate to me what it was that you were thinking, why you chose A instead of B or C? And if they're like, oh, well, I just guessed, that's a terrible answer, right? But it's like, oh, well, I was thinking that maybe if I chose A, there would be another option down this line that would allow me to do something else. And it's like, oh, well, you know what? A turned out to be not the best option, but at least your ability to explain to me why you thought it might have some
Yeah.
potential is really important, right? That's like the whole, you get partial credit for this. And that way, it's so, again, like just going back to why I find so much of this, in terms of like standardized testing, so dumb, right? If there's A, B, and C, and you choose A because you can see a glimmer of maybe how that could, and this is why I always was terrible at standardized tests, right? It's like that's actually smarter than somebody who just sniffs out what the test writer thought was going to be. Well, B is going to be the best answer because that's the way that this test wants me to answer, which is the way I did really well on the GREs, by the way. Is like, I took my GREs and I read the book and they're like, don't worry about what you know and what you don't know. This book is about teaching you how to take the GRE, right? And that's where, do we want to be teaching students how to master a specific simulation, or do you want them to be understanding why the simulation is set up in the way it is, why the results are coming out the way that they are, right? All those kind of things. So it's way more important. This is the whole thing. This is why, again, to the central point of this, you can't just throw a bunch of simulations on iPads, send them out to districts and have kids teach themselves, right? You need to have somebody there who is interacting with them every step of the way to be able to then sort of say like, well, who chose A? Why did you all choose that? Who chose B? Why did you choose? I'll choose that. And it turns out when you have that kind of interaction, that there may be a third of the class that chose A, but that third chose it for 4 or 5 different reasons. And it's like, it's not just, we've been slamming, the false dichotomy, the binary choice, all those kind of things. And it's like, that's kind of what all of this slides into, this efficiency model of we can only have 3 answers and we can only have a multiple choice test because that's the only way that we can get through this efficiently. And it's like, well, how about we just stop about trying to get through it efficiently and start trying to get through it a little bit more authentically? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So as somebody who is always like, I'm on the side of broad interpretation when I'm taking multiple choice tests, and that is the most miserable way. Could I make an argument for why any 4 of these could be right? I'm much better prepared to do that than I am to pick the best of 4 answers, right? Which is just...
I'm really glad you pointed that out because I was thinking specifically about my experience doing design work for the health center and the fact that when you were working with the School of Medicine, they wanted the multiple choice test because it had what they thought was a clear answer, and that would give them insight into what a particular learner was thinking. But like you, and I don't know if this is because I'm on the spectrum or what, but when I read the response options on a multiple choice test, I do that questioning of, well, under this circumstance, A would be correct, but what if it was this and maybe it's B, and there's not enough context here, but I know one of them has to be right because they can't have multiple correct answers, right? Versus what would happen when I was working with a dental school where they were more interested in, as I've said, as a broken record, what questions are the learners asking when they go through this process? So when they do their treatment plan or when they treat a patient and we're evaluating it, what are they asking me as the instructor? What kinds of reflection are they doing on their performance? What are they noticing? What are they not noticing? That ended up creating better educated learners who could then go out and do their jobs more effectively because they could ask better questions. And this is something we had said before of like the downside of going to Wikipedia or whatever. It's only going to give you a general answer to the thing you're probably dealing with situationally, which means you need to be able to put together and synthesize an answer because the real quote unquote true answer may not exist anywhere for you to read out of a book or on the internet. And that's the thing we really care about, the critical thinking component of this. I also was thinking about, I used to work briefly at Arizona State University Center for Games and Impact with Sasha Barab and some other folks who were doing educational game design. And the specific project I was brought on to work for as both a narrative designer doing sort of the writing of dialogue as well as an instructional designer organizing the sequence of activities and what those should be and why. Well, one of the things that Sasha and I sort of butted heads about, and maybe that's too strong a word, or too strong a phrase, but we had a disagreement about the options that a player should be presented. So for a little bit of context here, the project was meant to teach educators, people who are in-service teachers, how to incorporate project-based approaches to teaching or pedagogy into their classrooms. And it was meant for an international audience. It was supposed to be asynchronous until you got to the point where there was a sort of social media aspect where you're going to be able to connect with other teachers and share your projects, whatever. My suggestion was, well, what if we do this as a choose your own adventure? And so every step of the way, you're talking to teachers, and I'm putting those in air quotes, they would be NPCs, it's sort of virtual teachers. And again, like in addition to that suggestion, I had said the options should reflect different kinds of attitudinal approaches to talking to those teachers. So maybe there's the enthusiastic option, and maybe there's the sort of indifferent option, or maybe there's the one that's antagonistic to other teachers, right? And the purpose of that was to create a safe space to fail so that you could see what would happen when you would pursue certain kinds of interactions with other educators, in addition to the content about project-based approaches. So the suggestion that Sasha had was, well, all of them should have the same tone, or they should all be oriented toward the same outcome. But my rebuttal to that was, well, then you're stripping agency of the person who's doing this. If you're going to give them four options that are functionally identical, don't give them an option at all. Like, why would you?
Right.
And then it's just going to be an audiobook, right? It's just going to tell you what you're doing. You're just going to get led on that rail system that is too constrained. And so, to kind of, if I could provide a thoughtful critique or addition to your metaphor about the roller coaster versus the bumper cars, I think the bumper cars are actually the median version or the medium version of that analogy.
Because you're not in the field, right? Like you still are.
Right. You're not in a field. So I think that like if you were doing a race on a highway, like a public highway, or you're just driving out in the desert, that might be the version that has no constraints whatsoever, versus the roller coaster, which is very, very constrained. And then somewhere in the middle is bumper cars, right? That you have the ability to move about somewhat freely. This is the parallel to this was when I had talked in a previous episode about the sandbox on rails. It's sort of the bumper car version, where you as the instructor are deciding what are the boundary constraints around what's happening in the classroom, how much freedom am I going to give them. And so with that specific project-based approaches project, I was arguing for a more bumper car model, whereas Sasha was more interested in the roller coaster model. And I'm not saying that that was wrong. It's just that it's different. And I think that the outcomes of that are, and again, it comes back to what are the learning objectives here. The learning objective is to strip out the actual process of talking to other educators and just making that a fait accompli for how it's going to happen. Sure, you can do it as that very strict roller coaster. But my thinking was, well, here's an opportunity to actually try to simulate what it's like to get the adoption of these things to happen in a real world K-12 environment. And there are other projects I've worked on like this. For the health center, I did a similar thing for teaching first year medical students about EKGs and tried to create a choose your own adventure where you could, as a doctor, give the patient bad advice. Like that was part of the choose your own adventure. And the reason why I wanted to do that is to give it some replayability, or to give a reason for the user to come back and try different options, but mostly because I wanted that to become a space where the instructor can then ask them, well, which approach was better or worse, or how did you think about the decision? Because ultimately that's going to better integrate some of these ideas that we've talked about previously with soft skills, with negotiation, with cooperation, in addition to the sort of textbook stuff you need somebody to know. Because if you have a patient that comes in and you're able to get their vitals very easily and you can do all these assessments on a very sort of quantitative level, sure, that's great. That's not the same as getting a patient with real world experience who might be in excruciating pain to sit still while you're also doing this thing. Or maybe somebody's coming in because they're doing something that is against doctor's orders and you need to convince them or persuade them that you need to do these tests, right? There's a real value in trying to cross integrate some of these social forces as part of the simulation. That's not to say that it has to be silly or it has to be serious. There's a gradient, I think, between these things, but the goal ultimately is, and I think going back to where I started, Kerbal Space Program does a pretty good job of threading that needle between something that's very silly and playful, but also could be used to teach these very specific processes or physical properties that are actually reflective of what happens in reality. And just to give a plug to some of my friends and colleagues at the University of Connecticut, they have been working on, their engineering education program has been working on a project called Mars an Expedition, or an engineering expedition. And the goal is to teach engineers how to think about ethical problem solving in the context of launching a rocket and populating Mars. And it is sort of a choose your own adventure in which you as the class, this is a large survey course of hundreds of students who are doing this every semester, that class gets to vote on which option are they going to take to cause the story to unfold. And those options do have a variety of outcomes. So the idea here is to then capture what did they do in the story as they're playing through this, and then talk about what were you thinking when you made the decision? How did the options change your thinking about this and cause a meta conversation about the decision-making process you want engineers to go through, as opposed to just giving them a 2-day training or a 2-hour training and then multiple choice test that says, do you know how to be a good engineer and make good ethical decisions, which there is plenty of research demonstrating does not work. So we're trying to situate all of this. We're trying to give people the freedom to make these decisions so that they can see the consequences of their actions in an environment that is safe to fail, safe to ask questions, safe to reflect on.
And I think that's where, too, it's one of those things that, as you were talking, I was thinking there is such a huge spectrum between success and failure, right? And this is sort of the idea, too, with, broadly speaking, for a multiple choice test, each individual question, generally speaking, I don't think people get partial credit. You either get the right answer or the wrong answer. So the idea that there is some safe space to fail may mean in 100 questions, you can still get 10 wrong and still get an A or something like that, right? Which is not really what I think either you or I are talking about, where it's like, if you ask someone a question, If you're giving an oral examination, they can give you an answer that is either spot on, they nail it, or they're kind of in the territory, or it's in left field or whatever. We had a conversation years ago about at what age were you when you finally realized you can't believe anything works ever because so many people are bad at their jobs, right? And it's like, there aren't that many people. And I mean, there's probably more people than we would like to admit that would like fail at their job every day, every task. But there are plenty that are doing like C to D level work, right? Like they are not really getting what it is that they're supposed to be doing, right? And then there are those people where it's like, oh, you ask and they give you the A plus answer, right? Like I'm going to fill in what you didn't even know you needed to know, when you ask the question, right? And I think that that's kind of the thing too for a simulation is yes, there will be things like if you did not do the math right, your rocket is not going to land in the spot where you want it to, right? Like that is just sort of pure math. But then there are all of these other questions that are around it where it's like, well, did you do this part good enough? You know what I mean? And then there's also like the question of in some sort of simulation, are you spending too much time getting something perfect that really doesn't matter, right? This is something that whenever I'm doing house projects with my father-in-law, because I'm terrible with my hands, and it's like we'll be putting up new drywall. It's like, oh, well, it's good enough for the guys we work for, which is me, right? You know what I mean? And it's like, yeah, it's good. I mean, if there's a little bit of bubbling or whatever, it's like, who cares? Well, we can live with that, right? So I think that this goes back to some of these questions about we've talked about this in earlier episodes in terms of scope of the project or the depth of the project, right? Like if you're a physician, for example, and this is one of the things that I think many well-intentioned physicians run into all of the time. Same thing with teachers, for God's sake. How much time per student or per patient are you going to take to make it perfect, right? To give them the perfect thing that they need versus how quickly can you get them to what they actually are going to be able to use, right? You know what I mean? And it's like, there's a whole bunch of research that if someone writes me a 4-page paper and I just cover the thing in notes, that they don't read it all, they can't absorb it all, right? And you're actually, and it takes forever, right, to really do that kind of line by line editing. And it's like, oh, well, that's something that maybe a professional editor would do for a book that is going to be published, not necessarily for an.
I was going to say you're triggering me about our writing process for this book, but yeah, exactly. Go ahead.
But point being is that there is sort of like you get it to this point and then move on to the next thing, right? You know what I mean? It's like you can't spend all day doing this. And if you're thinking about disaster response, if you're thinking about really tense political thing, you don't have all the time in the world. And this is where that idea that this is a safe space to, if not fail, maybe just not get it all right, or there was something better you could have done in this moment, right? Without needing to stick a friggin' letter grade or a numeric value on it, right? It's like you opted to do this. The best option would be this. You know what I mean? Or like, what I think that's where too, like I am always a fan, depending on, again, and the same is true for you as an instructor. How much time do you want to create or how much space do you want to give in your classes for any of these kinds of activities, right? Because you can very quickly be like, hey, we're running out of time. Let me just do a quick 2-minute, why we did this, go over all the points versus like a longer 15-minute postmortem debrief of being like, what did you all get from this, right? Like ideally, if you had limitless time, you would always go for the really rich kind of like, let's talk through this. But we don't have limitless time, right? So sometimes you do need to cut to the chase a little bit. And this is where too, like what are the steps that you feel your doctor should cut in order to make sure that they can see 30 patients in a day, right? You know what I mean? It's like, these are the kind of stupid questions that we are getting into when when efficiency is the thing that is driving it. Like, I am going to set an arbitrary number of the number of patients or the number of students that you need to see, or maybe it's not completely arbitrary, but in order for this business model to work, you need to see this many patients, you need to see this many students, right? And it's like, well, what's the diminishing returns on that? Like, at what point do you get beyond being able to do what they actually need, right? Like now I'm seeing 500 students, but they're hardly getting anything out of this, right? You know what I mean? As opposed to, let's dial that back to a more reasonable number. And it doesn't need to be me having a dinner with 5 students for the semester and really getting to know everything about them, right? But somewhere in the middle, there's that balance of, this is the best thing that you could do, or among one of the best things, or like, what if there's a couple different solutions, right? This is the other thing that I love about the flexibility of different simulations. And I was thinking while you were talking about it, that there was some simulation that I was playing where I'm, well, that's a ridiculous. Like there's, a couple options and then there's the ridiculous one. So I went through the best that I can and got my results or whatever. And then I went and I'm like, I'm just going to see what happens when you do the ridiculous things, right? And it turned out that the things that I thought were ridiculous actually wound up taking us taking the simulation into pretty genuinely interesting places, right? And I wish I could think about this specific because I'm talking in generalizations, but it was that kind of thing where I'm like, wow, that is interesting. Like this is going 180 degrees from where I thought it was going to go. And again, it's that whole question of can I pop the hood and see the workings under here to figure out why it was doing those things? And I mean, this is where too, even in this discussion, we're kind of going back and forth between taking a personal one person, like in a clinical exam environment where you are the physician, you are the student physician who is conducting an exam on an actual human being, right? That's more of a role play kind of scenario than a simulation, but they can be kind of hard to distinguish, or like when a simulation would bleed into a role play and then come back out. And again, as long as the parts are doing what you want them to do, and what you're always surrounding all of this with is good open conversation with space for people to be creative, to think outside the box. If you are the person who has constructed this and you've thought about it and you kind of thought through what are the different options that students could conceivably have, if someone comes up with something out of the box, you should, I would think, in most cases, be able to figure out, is this student really doing some lateral thinking and, applying themselves, or did they not read the chapter and they're making shit up? Right. I mean, like, that's where you as the professor can be like, wait a minute. Like, and then if you've ever done oral exams, like I think we both said that we have in the past, as soon as you start pushing on that, like, that's a really weird answer. You know what I mean? Like, where did you come up with that? Can you go back? Like, what readings are you drawing that from? Right. You get a whole hell of a lot of hemming and hawing right off the bat. Right. And it's like, okay, well, I see where this is going. You're just throwing stuff against the wall to see what works. Right. As opposed to a little bit more concerted, thoughtful kinds of pathways that people may be taking when they're trying to do their problem solving. I think too, one of the things that I've heard some of the people who did the what's the UN,
Model UN?
Model UN. I think I was talking to somebody. I went to a presentation where somebody was talking about how they were doing their own sort of like custom version of that. And one of the things that really rubbed me the wrong way was, depending on how all of the different countries or personalities acted or whatever, the professor was the one who decided what the outcome was going to be in 100% of the cases, right? And it was like, but that's you, right? I mean, like, you are deciding. That's not reality. That is you deciding what would be the like, this is the outcome, right? As opposed to, like, in one of the things that I was thinking during this presentation, I don't think I said it, is like, maybe you could give your argument of what you think the outcome would be as the professor with your evidence, and then say, what do you all think of that? You know what I mean? Like, what would you say in response to that? Like, would you add to this in some way? Would you be able to, whatever? But it was very much like, oh, if you choose to do that, then this country becomes a totalitarian dictator. It comes under the control of a totalitarian dictatorship. And I'm like, but again, like, that's just what you're saying this would do. And we know, I mean, this is one of the things too, where I think, the whole question of like, who's an expert, who has expertise, who gets to declare what would happen in these things, right, is something that has thrown us into a bit of a crisis in this part of the 21st century, because experts often get it wrong. People can say, like, we've had these comments about economists before, right? If you've got a situation and you're like, well, what would an economist say? Well, ask 10 different economists and they're going to give you 10 different answers. And only a couple of them are going to be on more or less right or whatever. And then you rerun it with the same people with a different scenario, and different people are going to be wrong and different people are going to be right. Right. And it's like, okay, well, part of the field of economics is trying to figure out who is the most consistently right and why. You know what I mean? And when is this replicable? Right. But there are so many chaotic events and things that disrupt. And it's basically like, we're just taking our best guess at this, right? My educated guess is better than your educated guess, but it's still a guess, right? It's like, it's still a guess at the end of the day.
As you've been talking, it reminded me very much of a project. Another of my colleagues / former advisors was a chief researcher on the principal researcher, Scott Brown, and the project was called Global Ed. They actually had gotten to multiple versions of this. So the last one I think they did was Global Ed 2, but it was interesting because when I was going through graduate school, this was his primary research focus, along with a number of other researchers from around the country and the world. The gist of it is, it's essentially like the Model UN, that every student group was assigned, these are middle school students who were assigned a country, and they then had to act through that country to coordinate with other countries in this model simulation. And the goal, they would be given some prompt at the beginning of the semester, and the goal would be ultimately to represent the viewpoints and concerns of a given country, and then come to some agreement about the socio-political outcome or the socio-political approach they were going to take to resolve a conflict. So, for example, water scarcity, it would be one of those. Now, this is a really great example, even before we had, you and I had ever, I think it's before you and I even met, that I was thinking about what would world building and a simulation based on that world building look like. This is pretty much the idealized version of it, where the world building for these students, they didn't actually get to do that part for themselves in this context. It was kind of given to them by the program. But I can imagine a version of this where you assign the respective countries to these groups, or the groups choose their countries, whichever way you want to do it. The only stipulation was they could not choose the United States. So they had to, the United States was always played by a graduate student who was participating as an observer and co-learner. And all these middle school students would have to choose another country they didn't know anything about. And so they would sort of construct the world model for that country based on whatever the prompt was or the timeline was. And then through that negotiation process, they would actually role play is not the right word. They would, I guess they would simulate, right? They would attempt to simulate what the leaders of these various countries would do given a crisis like water scarcity. And the idea was not only did you want them to learn a little bit about diplomacy, but you were also trying to teach them scientific concepts in addition to this. So it was sort of this cross-disciplinary social studies, science classroom activity. And then over the course of multiple weeks, the students would come up with their solution to this prompt. And then, as you said, there would be a debrief period where the teachers and the researchers would ask the students, how did you think about this? Why did you do it that way? So there was this very strict, or at least discernible, beginning, middle, end structure to the whole thing. And then those learners would come out of that process knowing a little bit more about science and social studies and diplomacy and soft skills as a result of doing this. And I think of that as being sort of the pinnacle of what we're trying to get folks to do with world building, right? Like if you're going to use simulation in addition to it, this is probably how you do it. You do the world building the first few weeks, and then you jump into the simulation where you're having the learners run across a timeline. Now, that could be a very tight timeline. It could be a very long period of time, but the goal would be to have them manipulate those dials to figure out, okay, what if I tweak this? What does that do for my negotiation? How does this change the way that we think about this specific problem? And as we were saying toward the beginning of this episode, get them to focus on the system, not necessarily on an individual person. So I want to clarify, unlike reacting to the past, which we've talked about before, is more role-playing centric, they were not playing as Barack Obama or Boris Johnson or Xi Jinping, right? They were not role-playing as that person. They were trying to speak on behalf of how a country would probably react to its neighbors or countries on the other side of the planet, which is a just different thing.
Yep. I think too, as you're talking, like another strategy that I like to use quite a bit would be, so, we're I would hesitate to use the word stuck, but a lot of times the students are doing the work and then the professor is or the instructor is doing the assessment, and it's just one-way traffic, right? It's one way to the instructor and one way back. And another thing that you could do, and this is just as good, because again, the point of it is for them to understand the material, right? So if you've got 4 groups, A, B, C, and D, and they each have their own scenario, and then they have to run the simulation and say, this is how we would respond. Another thing that you can do is then B grades A, C grades B, or not grades, but assesses. Like, what do we think the answer that group B gave? What do we think the response would be to this, right? So it's like it's coming from students, and then students are giving it back, and you as the instructor are there to be the one to be like, hey, if I were assessing this as though it were a midterm, I would be asking these questions. I would be wanting to know this, right? I would be wanting to know that. And I think the appeal of doing this kind of thing, it's the same thing like why we always do in writing classes, why most all of them have some sort of peer feedback, is because you don't want to be just the only voice in the room who is saying, this is good writing, this is bad writing, this worked for me, this didn't work for me, right? It's more sort of about a consensus. And that's where if you would say, okay, here's your scenario, here's what changes. Now you give me what you think would be the simulation, right? So in groups of 4 or 5 or whatever it is, your group comes up with a little description of what you think the simulation is with a rationale why. Now pass that to the group on your right. Now you've just got a new simulation, you've just got the new response, and can you work through and what you understand, in terms of how these things would react, what unforeseen problems would happen, what kind of things would this address, and all this. And it's like, if they know that you as the instructor are going to be assessing their answer to whatever, to their response to whatever thing they got, well, they've got that pressure, but I mean, sort of like a good pressure that they need to perform. They need to be able to think on both sides of the equation rather than them just being in the, you asked a question and now I have to answer it. And then you get to judge the quality of my answer, right? You know what I mean? Like that's what it, essays, whatever. It's like, well, why couldn't it be more broad discussion? I'm going to give you the answer. And then a bunch of us are going to give feedback on that answer. And some of them are novice learners. Some of them are going to be the expert in the room, but it just becomes much more organic. And I think what I always come back to as we're talking about this is just the sheer artificiality of having a classroom in which you're doing textbook learning and either short, like either short answer questions or multiple choice. When you get out in your career, you are never going to face those scenarios, right? Like I can't think of a single job in which you would be in that scenario, in which you're doing multiple choice during the day or writing short answers, right? It's always this weird hybrid thing where you've got some people who you get along with and sort of like see eye to eye with, people who drive you nuts, things that seem like a slam dunk that turn out to be a huge pain, right? That's the way your career works. As many times as people say that, this is like the topic for a whole other episode. Are universities making students career ready, right? And it's like, number one, what the fuck are you talking about, right? Is like the first question, like which career? We've got, my school's got 22,000 students who are probably going to go to 21,000 different employers. Doesn't it seem a little weird that we would be responsible for attending to all of that, right? And isn't it better that we would just be thinking about how are they going? We should be training them to be able to hit the ground running when they get into your, to be able to get trained up and become a good, productive employee within your business. I have no problem with that. But then the thing that drives me nuts is when everyone is like, we need to have more real world skills. We need to have more on, whatever. Okay. Are you an instructor? Do you know anything about how to teach people? Do you know anything about any of this? Because I'm going to tell you, you don't. Right. So it's like, if we're not getting the result that, employers, why it's employers who get to drive the bus for what higher ed is doing is I'm getting angry now. They get a stupid conversation. Right. But even if it's like we're not producing, students are not able to come out doing the things we want them to do. Right. If that's something that we all agree on. And I don't think it's something that we all agree on, because I think people also forget how inexperienced a 22-year-old is. Like, what experiences can you give them in 4 years in university that is going to make them be able to take on tasks that we don't even know what they're going to be asked to do based on their job, all these kind of things. But it's like, what? The more that we double down on testing, the more that we double down on grades, the more that we double down on all of this stuff, it's like, do you not see that this has not worked? And maybe going in the exact opposite direction where we care less about that numeric assessment and do more with this wiggle room, fluid, whatever. It seems to me that we may do a better job training students for whatever comes down the road for them by having a more fluid conversational style of education that includes things like simulation, role play, where there's some rules and there is rigor, right? Like all of these things, rules, rigor, whatever. Like there are certain things that, you're not just going to be able to wave a wand and make that happen. There's always going to be, trade-offs or whatever, but having it be less, we know what the answers are, and you've got to work to learn to get to the island of answers that we're on, right? As opposed to, hey, look, like I was sort of saying before, what age do we get to where it's like, how does anything work because so many people are bad at their jobs? That's kind of, that's the mentality where school is set up as though everybody is great at doing everything, and you've got to be the cog that fits in. And if you don't fit in, you're going to be the one breaking the machine, right? And it's like, well, it turns out that the machine is like a pile of rusty pieces. You know what I mean? It's like, what the hell? None of I got to sort of do it yourself, right? Like none of this stuff works without me, being engaged. So is education maybe in these kinds of processes, is this a way of being able to get students better prepared, not just for their friggin' jobs, which is important, but their entire lives, right? Attending to all of their lives. And
that's another thing, well, just to interrupt you for a moment.
Yeah,
but, Mike, I'm saving your blood pressure, but Mike Young and I used to say this to our colleagues all the time, that part of the thing that they didn't understand about ed tech specifically was that there are two ways you could really teach ed tech. One of them is we're just going to teach them the tools that already exist. Like we're going to show you how to make a PowerPoint. We're going to show you how to use social media. We're going to show you how to do this, that, or the other thing. That's what students wanted, or that's what they said they wanted. Our counter to that, or our proffer in a different direction was, how about we try to be proactive? And instead of teaching them about a tool that they might need, like, say, a smart board or an interactive whiteboard, which will be obsolete by the time they actually get into their career, why don't we talk to them about the principles behind how technology is integrated into a classroom, how all that theory stuff that gets pushed to the side, like maybe that's actually useful here because we want them to be able to make judgments about technologies that haven't yet emerged. And I think all the time about the students that I worked with over the last 15 years, the number of technological developments they have had to grapple with as educators, like even
Yep.
just going back 5 years. COVID happens. Now they all have to do flipped classroom models. If you're a fourth grade teacher doing flipped classroom, you have a bunch of problems you're going to have to grapple with, and you're not going to be able to solve all of them, or maybe
Yep.
even most of them. How are you going to think about the way you integrate different tools into that environment now that you have completely changed the context in which you're operating? Same thing with virtual reality, same thing
Yep.
with AI or LLMs. We wanted those students to be able to get out of school and then go into the workforce as educators with the critical thinking capacity to make sense of utilizing ADDIE and TPACK to decide which technologies made the most sense for the environment I'm in now, which is
Hmm.
10 years
Hmm.
from when I'm
Yep.
teaching them.
Yep.
And so
Yeah.
it's just what you're making me think about as you're describing this. It's like that was an argument because there were people who thought we needed to be reactive and not
Right.
proactive. And there's
Right.
a great book that is entirely about what differentiates successful schools from unsuccessful ones.
Hmm.
And the main focal point of the book ends up being the schools that took risks to do proactive kinds of simulation or
Yep.
activities that were
Yep.
going to try and train those skills for critical thinking and empathy. Those are the schools that were successful. The ones that were
Yep.
least
Yep.
successful were the ones that did the stuff that worked well 3 years ago, and then they
Yep.
just decided to keep doing it because
as
that was
soon as the
habit.
as soon as the target moves, as soon as the context changes, you're done. Right. And this is where
Mhm.
I think one of the things too, like just with our mentality, and this is something that I've had some excellent engineering students who are just sort of like whatever they chose to go into, they were going to be great. And I've also had some engineering students who drive me absolutely crazy because their approach is this is a tricky problem. So let's simplify the problem and create an answer
Mhm.
for that. And I'm like, okay, but that answer is not going to work because it is not attending to all the things. And that's why we have things like wicked
Mhm.
problems. So, like if you're not sure what a wicked problems are, these persistent issues that crop up across different
I'm
kinds of
glad you brought this
societies
up.
across
Yeah.
time, right? We talk about this in the book. And it's like the reason why, if everything were just, I also talked to about, mentioned how much I hate the book Freakonomics, because it's like, that's what that is a case in point of that. And like, here's a really complex problem with lots of different moving parts. And what I'm going to
Mhm.
do is simplify it all and then give a solution. Right. And it's like,
Mhm.
well, sometimes you can do that and sometimes you can't, or, you know what I mean? Maybe it's putting a band-aid on a gushing wound or, whatever, but it's never, I mean, if it were that simple, we wouldn't have wicked problems. We would have solved all this
Mhm.
stuff before. Right. So then that's just sort of the point. It's never that simple. The world is always changing. There's always personalities involved. And we're not doing a very good job, I don't think, in terms of training students to be able to just move, right? It's like we joke too about the lousy, who moved my cheese book, for the whatever. It's like that's kind of the thing, right? Is which you used to get a job, you'd stay in the same job for 30 years, you get a Rolex, and then
Mhm.
you retire, right? And it's like, well, that doesn't work anymore. You need to be much more agile. You need to be much more ability, changing jobs, and being able to change different conditions. So I don't know why we wouldn't be trained. I mean, I know exactly why we wouldn't be training students to do that because it's too inefficient. Right?
Mhm.
It's much more efficient to say you're going to be an engineer and this is what engineers need to learn, go, right? Rather
Mhm.
than life is a complex, scary place. You're going to be, facing all of these different things at different times. Here is a whole different kind of network of ways of thinking about the world and problem solving because that's way too messy and inefficient. If you're people like us, I think you start looking at the world as simulation. You're not looking at the world
Yeah.
as role play. Like we've set these systems up in a way that makes them essentially like simulations, right? Like you can take
Mhm.
those knobs proverbially, or whatever, metaphorically, and play with those in a society, just as we're seeing, right? You can crank up taxes, you can do this, you can do that. That's the way our society, sort of like technocratic society, kind of works. And then the same thing with role play. Like I am role playing being a goofy professor in this moment, and I'll role play being a dad in a minute, right? And it's like those are actual roles that I have, but
Yeah.
I play different roles in different moments.
Yeah, this I guess my parting thought will be a shout out to our friend and colleague Roger Travis and his coining of the term practimime, which is performative play practice. This idea that when you are performing in a specific environment, we all agree that that's what we should be doing. Like play is the thing we're doing. The reason why he started talking about this back in 2009, 2010 was because he was really interested in how are we constituting play? What does that actually mean? what does it mean that what you're describing happens, that we are performing in all of these different venues? So if you're doing sock puppets with your kids, well, that's a kind of play, right? And how are we thinking about the affordances of that for education? And he's a classicist. He's really interested in Latin and ancient Greek and ancient Greek society. And I think a lot of this, or most of it, I would say, goes through the lens of what would ancient societies have thought about some of these things. How did they portray it? He has this really, I think, compelling argument that Plato's Cave is the first video game. And we can set aside what that actually means. Like, it's not relevant necessarily to this conversation, but the idea being that we should be thinking about what performance is and what does it mean in different contexts. And as you noted, that I think you and I are predisposed to doing this, I know I am, because I mask when I'm in public. So because I'm on the spectrum, like, masking is a thing I had to do as a survival mechanism to be able to get through social situations. And it's very much like being on the outside looking in at other people and wondering, why do they do that? Or how did they come to that conclusion, or whatever. And I see world building and simulation as a way to help other people do that, not because I want to make them feel otherized by the world they're in, but because I think it's a useful way for them to both evaluate their own behaviors and attitudes, as well as understand what is the role that they have in these systems and what can they do to make those systems function more smoothly. So I guess if we were going to get a big question to this episode, it'd be, what is the point of a simulation in the context of teaching with world building? It really is that. It's to help them see their place in these systems and then take action in those systems to cause change that is hopefully fruitful. And, like you said, wicked problems exist. It's not always that easy, but the idea is to give them the tools necessary to go out into the world and make a difference in a way that we couldn't necessarily predict in the moment as we're teaching. So I guess that's my pin on the end of it. And as we noted, the next episode will be all about role play, which will probably be a bit sillier because we both do role play for fun. We have participated in a number of role plays together as colleagues, as friends, whether that's Fiasco or Vaesen or Dungeons and Dragons or any other tabletop role playing game or video game based role play like Valheim. There's a bunch of different ways that we have thought about integrating role play as a tool into a teaching and learning environment. And I'm excited to have that conversation. I think it'll be fun.
Me too. Love role-playing games. Okay, so we'll call it there, and then next time we will wax poetic on role-playing games.
Perfect.
Thanks, Steve.
See y'all later.
Bye-bye.
The World Building Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The World Building Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Free copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.